So having said that, again, welcome. Welcome to all of you. We're very, very pleased to be presenting this program this afternoon. We have some very special guests with us. Of course, we have Mira Shimabukuro, who'll be talking to us about her new book, Relocating Authority. Lane Hirabayashi will be providing some opening remarks, and Thomas Fujita-Rony will be the moderator for our discussion. So it's really fitting that we're having this discussion here in Inahara Hall. It's right in front of one of the original barracks from the Heart Mountain War Relocation Center, where over the course of 4 years, 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry were held in barracks just like this in the World War II concentration camps. So it's also fitting that we're here. It was on this very site 75 years ago that a majority of Los Angeles's Japanese community and Japanese American community were forced onto buses to go to the camps. I hope that you'll have time, if you haven't seen it already, I hope you'll have time to visit our Instructions to All Persons exhibition downstairs. It commemorates the 75th anniversary of Executive Order 9066. And we have the last 2 pages of the original executive order on display. And the 3rd page has President Roosevelt's signature on it. And it's, in many senses, you look at the document and it's quite banal in its ordinariness. And it's a government document. It's been printed by, it was typed on a typewriter of that time. But when you look at that signature and you understand the full impact of that signature, the impact on communities, on families, on homes, on livelihoods, on aspirations, it's devastating. It's devastating in its consequence. And it's also devastating to see it in the midst of the exhibition downstairs. So I do hope that you'll visit the exhibition if you haven't already seen it. So it's my privilege now to introduce to you Lane Hirabayashi, who lead us through the program this afternoon. He probably requires very little introduction, but for those of you who don't know him, I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. He's a full professor at UCLA and holds the George and Sakaya Aratani Chair in Japanese American Incarceration, Redress, and Community in the Asian American Studies Center at UCLA. He teaches courses on Japanese American experience, Asian American history through the medium of documentaries, and contemporary issues in the Asian American community, among other classes. He's also the author and editor of over 30 scholarly articles, as well as 9 books and anthologies, including a biographical project based on his uncle, Gordon K. Hirabayashi, who defied the curfew and mass removal of Japanese Americans on the West Coast. We've had Lane speak about that book. He spoke to us, I think it was September 2013. And we've, of course, had the privilege of working with him and UCLA on various partnership programs over many years. And he'll be retiring this summer. So I'm very, very pleased, Lane, to bring you up to the podium. Thank you so much. And I look forward to our program.
Well, good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be here. I have worked on and off with the museum for quite a while, and it's always a pleasure because my late father was very invested in JANM and spent a lot of time talking to me about what the museum was about, what its potentialities were. And I think being able to chat with him about various projects over the years was something I'll really treasure. So Mira Shimabukuro's book here, Relocating Authority, is the 4th book in the Nikkei in the Americas series published by the University Press of Colorado. This is one of the ongoing initiatives that I was able to start while serving as the Aratani Endowed Chair at UCLA. At this point, we receive somewhere 5 to 10 manuscripts or book proposals a year. Since it costs the press on the average about $35,000 to publish each book, we usually study each submission carefully. When I say we, by the way, that's to indicate that the director of the press, the acquisitions editor, Jessica DeArborn, and myself all evaluate each submission. Naturally, I have my own criteria in mind, though. So how, you might ask, did I look at Mira's manuscript when the press first brought it to my attention? The first criteria is credibility. I always look at the quality of each submission, and in Mira's case, there was absolutely no doubt that she'd done her homework. Relocating Authority was, as a matter of fact, based on years of research carried out at the University of Wisconsin, which is where Mira wrote her doctoral dissertation. And naturally, as someone who has subsequently been hired at a variety of campuses to teach English, including presently the University of Washington, Mira's writing is very polished. To me, writing excellence is also a sign of credibility and merit. A second criterion has to do with creativity and originality. When looking at possible publications for our series, I always ask myself, does the author present a new, original, and compelling perspective on the topic? Clearly, in Mira's case, she does. Why? Relocating Authority highlights Japanese Americans' written responses during the 1940s in regard to their roundup, removal, and incarceration. Mira does this in an especially sophisticated fashion, creating original conceptual tools deeply rooted in Nikkei history, cultural values, and community. Moreover, since Mira is a poet and a creative writer, as well as an English professor, her persona finds its way into the sometimes surprisingly lyrical prose she crafts to reveal the relationship between vernacular writing and day-to-day resistance, as well as her personal relationship to the authors, or intellectual relationship is maybe the better way to put that, whose texts she examines. The third criterion I exercise has to do with marketability, right? Because we're ensconced in a capitalist society, so that's kind of intangible. And questions I ask include: would a manuscript appeal to the so-called general reader? Is a particular book likely to be picked up for college classes, right? Because these days that's a big element of sales, right? Is one of our colleagues going to use it to teach? And another thing I do that might surprise you or not is I do take a look at my colleagues' standings as teachers. Because you can go online and find just about anything these days, right? In this regard, Mira is reputed to be a demanding but worthwhile instructor. You'll have to work hard, wrote one student online, but she'll teach you how to write. Man, I looked at that and I said, wow, okay. Because I learned to write in college, right? Because someone cared to teach. I went to state college, by the way, so someone cared enough to teach me how to write. And Mira students say, she cares enough to teach them to write, but it's work, right? And they all talk about this online. So from comments like that, and based on her University of Washington website, where she delineates her approach to teaching, Mira is clearly a person who puts her heart and soul into her pedagogy. And that, in my view, counts for everything, because you can see so clearly that Mira strives to reach her audience in an effort to impart her messages. And I think that's whether in the classroom or whether we take a look at her book to see what she has to tell us. In terms of credibility, creativity, and marketability, Mira's Relocating Authority exemplifies our mission in terms of the Nikkei in the Americas book series. And so publishing it really was what they call a no-brainer. So this afternoon, we're fortunate to be able to hear from Mira first, and then we'll listen to her in conversation with our colleague, Professor Thomas Fujita-Rony. So please join me in welcoming Professor Mira Shimabukuro. Congratulations.
Well, thank you all very much for coming. It's really a delight. I live in Seattle. It's really a delight to be back at JANM, where I did a good chunk of the research for this book just downstairs. When I finished my dissertation in 2009, which is what the book is based on, I used to tell people, I told my committee, in fact, that same day, that I wasn't actually going to feel like I was completely done and like I had defended the work until I started to present the book and the work in Nikkei communities. So today I feel probably just as nervous as I did on that day back in 2009, but I'm happy to be here. So what does it mean for an incarcerated community to write to redress? That's the focus of this book. In other words, how did incarcerees use writing to set right what was wrong about and relieve the suffering caused by the mass imprisonment of Nikkei people during World War II? How were their actions both a matter of writing in order to redress wrongs and a matter of writing toward the redress of wrongs? And what did the writing, both the activities and the texts, mean for subsequent generations? What do they mean for us today? In other words, what does it mean for people governed by the War Relocation Authority to use writing to relocate that authority governing their lives back into the Nikkei community itself? Usually at this point in my talk, I give a little bit of background for those unfamiliar with what took place during the time, but many of us know, and Anne spoke to this earlier, that in spring 1942, the US government forcibly, quote unquote, relocated over 120,000 US residents of Japanese ancestry and placed them into what has been called variously internment, concentration, or incarceration camps. When I started doing my work, there had been very little analysis or studies available in my fields of study, which is rhetoric and composition or writing studies. There had been studies that existed in literary studies, so work looking at fiction and poetry, but not in the field of my focus, which is less about polished, crafted writing and more about how people use writing to live their lives. Aside from that fact, though, so I wanted to speak back to that. But aside from that, the main reason why I think writing from the camps is so important is because since World War II, incarcerated Nikkei have often been portrayed as the quote-unquote quiet Americans, suggesting that they both passively consented to their forced imprisonment and fully succumbed to the racist logic that upheld these government policies. And these perceptions helped lay the groundwork for the contemporary stereotype of Asians as model minorities. Yet, even as many of us know that this stereotype is false, we often buy into aspects of it. Sometimes this is done to construct more heroic tales of people who did, in fact, resist. So now I'm going to read a little bit from the book. I was raised amidst these progressive at the time myths that while Nikkei who talked back or complained or retained any bitterness at all were individually heroic, they were still numerically few. Japanese people didn't talk back. Hell, they barely even talked. You never heard them on TV. You never heard them in a movie. I could barely hear my own father when he spoke, even though my stepmother always said that in his mind he was yelling. And as much as I remember each and every intimate moment I spent with my Nikkei grandmother, the feel of her hands, the smell of her clothes and hair, the shape of her smile, not only did I never hear her complain about anything, I'm not even sure I ever heard her at all. To this day, I can't remember the sound of her voice. And as a poet obsessed with sensory memory, I remember sound. Meanwhile, as my father's involvement with the redress movement heated up, the books poured into our home, shedding silence, breaking silence, even the quiet Americans, all without any conversations about differences or nuances in meaning. And in the roughly 50-50 white-black post-busing public schools that I attended in Portland, Oregon, many of which had started to attend to the heroic accounts of African American struggle, Japanese Americans were barely known. Mass incarceration, if taught at all, was something I brought into the classrooms or mentioned to my teachers. And since my schools seemed so race-conscious, I often presumed the myths that seemed progressive at the time must be true. That while camp was clearly bad, very few incarcerees engaged in conscious struggle, that those who did were numerically insignificant, that Nikkei incarcerees were generally quiet or even silent, that this silence meant they were passive, and that really it took the sensei to make some noise and spur those old folks to redress all they had endured. Of course, there's no reason to share any of this unless I now know those myths were wrong. And for me, it's everyday writing that helps us see this. I wanted to see writing written in response to incarceration, but I wanted to see writing that was composed away from government eyes. As such, I did not focus on writing in camp newspapers, nor on assignments written in camp schools, nor on writing published in camp literary magazines. This is not to say I don't think there are things to learn from looking at those sets of writing. There are. But I was interested in seeing if writing was being used to help people contend with their circumstances. And that meant looking for writing that wasn't simply penned by people who were already seen as writers with a capital W, or good students who did their homework. So I entered the archives. As eager as I was to enter and access the archives at the Japanese American National Museum and online at Densho, I couldn't have been prepared to find what I did, especially at JANM. Diaries in both Japanese and English, multiple drafts of petitions, quick sketched poetry, neatly labeled letters, chaotic files of news clippings and notations, mimeographed handbills and flyers, handwritten script, fading paper, crossed out text, illegible notes. The more I found, the more I could barely remember to breathe. The feelings alternated between utter excitement and utter embarrassment. Sometimes I felt my face burn, ashamed I did not know. Each piece of paper a slap in the face. How could you think we wouldn't write? How could you think we would just sit there in camp? How could you think we wouldn't try to make and remake our lives? There in the archives, I had to face myself facing the vast display of written activity spread across the table. I both had and had not believed the lies. Like so many other progressives before me, I had, at various points in my life, maintained the myth of the passive American so I could individually proclaim, that's not me. And yet, there it was, Nikkei dissidence, the quiet and loud complaints, angst, swearings, bitterness, protests, and resistance I had hoped for but was not sure I would find. In JANM, I could touch the paper, touch the words, touch the penciled script or mimeographed ink. I could see the quick drafted poems on pages of pre-printed diaries, uneven dashes typed in the dates, spiral-bound paper, handwritten and wide-ruled, tiny drawings filling in the space between all the text. On some documents, crossed out text and handwritten notes projected images in my mind of real hands writing, committed to making the words perform the writer's intent. And in Densho, in a newer form of literacy, digital access allowed me to attend video testimonies far from the physical location of the agents who voiced their memories in public. Memories of women and men pilfering time for poems written in camp hospitals, rewriting questions on the infamous loyalty forms, hand-cutting stencils of flyers for mimeographs, or hiding illegal agendas and handwritten notes inside a basket of freshly ironed clothes. In other words, amidst the drafts and diaries and descriptions and details, my own archival recollecting became not a close reading of texts, but a close reading of activities, a reading of practice, of literacy and action. While individual examples of both polished and draft forms of found writings were fascinating in themselves, the more I attended these recollections of writing, the more compelled I grew by the sheer amount of it all. The patterns of social activity, the multiplicity of involvement. While my research is far from quantitative, it became harder and harder to believe that writing to redress could even be numerically insignificant. So as I gathered and organized the sources I was finding, I started to think about the ways writing was responding to both the removal and the imprisonment of the Nikkei community, the ways in which it redressed the wrongs of incarceration, the ways writing was being used to set both right the wrong and relieve the suffering caused by mass imprisonment. From there, I started to think in two broad categories: private and public forms of writing. As my analysis evolved, I realized I wanted to try and understand the private writing in a culturally relevant manner. I talk about this process at length in the book, but through that desire, I came to the term writing to gaman. From here, I started to analyze the writing I was finding through the cultural lens of gaman, a term often cited as one ethos or community value governing behavior during the camp years. In the book, I spent several pages discussing the complex rhetorics of gaman within US-based Nikkei communities and the way it can be used to either mean accepting of or persevering through oppression and adversity. And the history surrounding the still evolving meaning is complex and layered, especially for activists. But no matter what, in order to gaman, one must strive to focus inwardly while maintaining an outward silence, all to endure hardship so as not to inflict further emotional strain on others. Since writing allows one to remain outwardly silent yet still be verbal on the page, it is the perfect technology for putting gaman into rhetorical action. In other words, I contend that private writing enables one to both gaman and perform social action at the same time. Once I figured this out, I started to look for patterns that I thought helped one use writing to practice gaman. In other words, used writing to break into print in order to privately express dissent, collect one's emotion thoughts, and heighten one's understanding of others enduring hardship. So here's one example of diaries being used for private dissent. This is from Yashuko Uchida's diary, the award-winning children's book author. Here you can see Uchida complaining about pending policies, swearing at Attorney General Earl Warren, but rhetorically bleeping herself out on the page, and using capital letters, underlined text, sometimes double and triple underlines, and repeated exclamation points. So all the while she may have been quiet in person while in camp, she is essentially yelling on the page. And this was not uncommon throughout her diary. In another diary, an anonymous woman writes of her anxious desire to ease people's lives in camp, all the while legitimizing the community's gaman-like ideals, saying that people won't respect her unless she can calm herself down and cultivate her, quote, rattle brain. For Mary Nakahara, writing to gaman not only enabled her to verbalize dissent and organize her emotion thoughts, but also sharpen her awareness of others enduring hardship, the social component of gaman. Here on the cover of her diary, she writes of her explicit desire to avoid writing anything that would, quote, hurt, humiliate, look down, blame, or show dislike for any person, nation, race, religion, or station in life. But in camp, The first time she lives solely among other Nikkei, she learns endless stories of anti-Japanese discrimination from older co-workers. For example, in an entry dated September 9th, 1943, she writes that she has just learned from a prospective nursing student, a young Nikkei woman she never met, from one of her co-workers. Nakahara proceeds by writing about this young woman and the hospital she wrote to asking for admittance to their nursing program. After stating bluntly that, quote, no one would accept her, Nakahara struggles with her own reaction and copies 14 different rejection letters into her journal, almost as if she has to internalize the evidence herself. As a young female office worker herself, Nakahara seems to identify with the young woman, but also sees the adverse experience as beyond herself, as she writes that she will not, quote, really be able to understand the problems of the Nisei until she, quote, comes up against prejudice and discrimination. An ironic statement, of course, since she was writing from a concentration camp. But as a whole, this entry, with its 14 copied letters, like the 1.5 you see on this page, suggests a need to witness hardship, even if only for oneself. This writing activity then became one of convincing the self that one is living among others that are truly being impacted by negative forces, even if that self is not. So in this way, Nakahara, who later becomes the much beloved activist Yuri Kochiyama, used private writing to regularly think through or sharpen her awareness of others enduring hardship. But of course, writing was not just used in private ways to write to redress. Nikkei incarcerees were using writing to protest conditions from the first announced curfew throughout the camp years. One of the more famous pieces is, of course, the bulletin of the Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee, refusing induction into the Army until all rights of citizenship were restored. What I found interesting was how much public writing to redress was collective. And I mean this in a number of ways. There were a number of collectively authored documents, like this bulletin, for example, but also the collective synergy that enabled or authorized the written declaration of such bold stances. In other words, the energy created through the process of organizing, the creation of that felt sense that people had each other's back, the collective contributions of funds, of labor, of spirit, all the energy that any good community organizer knows can begin to feed itself, energy that is infectious and empowering, energy that amasses as a movement grows. And such collective or amassed authority brought forth documents after documents, petitions, letters, demands, many of which I discuss in more detail in the book. But I also want to say that understanding this collectivity is particularly important for understanding women's writing to redress, or women's role in writing to redress, which has been described somewhat dismissively as simply supportive. But just as feminist political economists have argued that domestic labor is critical to the reproduction of capital and social relations, so was the feminized labor of the 1940s critical in enabling the written rhetoric of the Fair Play Committee. In this bulletin, for example, and many of the activities surrounding the FPC's successful organizing in Heart Mountain, women played very important roles that are perhaps less known. One of the FPC leaders, Frank Emmy, told me, for example, that his sister could type much faster than Emmy. So she typed many of the Fair Play Committee documents. She also went to meetings being held by the JACL and took notes for Frank and the other FPC leaders, since FPC members would easily be recognized and called out. Her notes enabled the committee to better anticipate what JACL leaders were saying about them, which in turn helped them construct stronger arguments and better organize among incarcerees. In this way, Emmy's sister, Kaoru Emmy, greatly contributed to the Fair Play Committee's rhetorical and material activities. So we need to consider the ways any single document was, in fact, authorized by many actions performed by many hands, including the hands of women. And women didn't just enable writing from behind the stage. There are numerous examples of women writing as women, often inhabiting the subject position of mothers in order to protest the living condition of the camps: lack of winter clothing, lack of running or hot water, lack of nutritious food. Here's one such example from the Hunt Relocation Center, also known as Minidoka, where women and mothers who identified themselves as, quote, the ladies of Hunt Relocation Center, protested the lack of hot water due to a, quote, labor dispute between camp administration and the workers. The authors of this letter placed no blame at the feet of the workers. Instead, they placed their demands on the administration, indirectly proclaiming which side they were on. Women also wrote to protest policy, like the government's announcement of the draft. And in reclaiming the anti-war roots of Mother's Day, let me talk about letters from mothers of draft-age sons that emerge in 3 different camps. I spent a full chapter on the creation of this letter from the Mothers Society of Minidoka, which over 100 women signed, and I'll say a bit more about it in a bit. But letters like it also emerged in at least Poston, where at least 100 women signed a letter, and in Topaz, where at least 1,000 women signed a letter. In all 3 cases, groups of mothers, predominantly Issei women, wrote authorities to protest some aspect of the drafting of their sons. And the mothers at both Poston and Minidoka wrote and sent their letters before the Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee even took their public stand. So I first learned about this letter from Karen Nishizuka and her book, Lost and Found. But over the course of my archival research in Densho Video Histories collection, and some investigative work and personal interviews in the Seattle area, I was able to piece together the story behind this document. This letter was actually the second version of a letter that women hoped to send, the first being a version drafted for them by Min Yasui. They had previously tried to get their sons to take a public stand on their own, but for the most part, the young men in Minidoka were reluctant, which is why the women asked Yasui to write something for them that they could sign. But the women were deeply unsatisfied with what Yasui wrote. They said that the wording was, quote, too weak. And 3 of them, including a woman named Fuyo Tanagi, a former assistant editor at a Japanese immigrant newspaper, took it upon themselves to rewrite the letter into the one that was actually sent. In other words, after first handing the metaphorical mic to Min Yasui, they grabbed it back because they did not like what he had said. And metaphorically, they spoke into it themselves, directly questioning not only the hypocrisy of the draft, but also the, quote, so-called military necessity of incarceration in general, including the, quote, baseless and vague argument used to deny citizenship to their sons in the first place. So, these kinds of texts and the stories that surround them are really important for us in understanding the kinds of responses to incarceration by Nikkei generally, but also by Nikkei women specifically. Especially since women's agency and resistance and personhood in camp has still not received the attention that it deserves. So here's a picture of all the signatures of the women, which is now available on Densho, the Densho site. For me, learning of these women and of stories like Kaoru Emi have been critical in rethinking women's participation and labor in activities of dissent, activities of redress, not just in the 1970s and 80s, but during the 1940s themselves. So these stories have really helped me re-listen to silence, re-listen to outward silence that could have been caused by people finding quiet ways to voice or perform dissent, and re-listening to loud public statements like the FPC manifesto or the letter from the Mothers of Minidoka that were silenced by powers that be in the ways that they were ignored and covered up. So listening to both these kinds of silence has helped me hear how redress started in camp, not during the 1970s or 80s. That dissent was present, but it was both quietly expressed and loudly performed. And I think this is helpful for thinking about the now, the way dissent is building, collecting, pooling, and some of it is and will be performed in loud and public ways, and some of it will be quieter, but building nonetheless, perhaps for public acts to come. For me, these texts and stories of writing help us understand our history, our personhood, and agency better, which in turn helps enable us to respond to ongoing acts of injustice, helps us struggle for a redress of wrongs against others and ourselves, helps us know that we have the power to collectively relocate authority in times like the now. And this is a shot from the airport protests in Seattle, and I know there were also big ones here in Los Angeles. So these examples just barely scratch the surface of what I discuss and what is probably still out there waiting to be read and learned, waiting in other archives, both old and new. There are so many stories to find, so many legacies to uncover, so much authority to relocate and claim. Thank you.
Hi, folks. Thanks for coming. I'd urge all of you to go ahead and buy this book. It is an amazing work. My name is Thomas Fujita-Rony. I teach at Cal State Fullerton in the Asian American Studies program, and Japanese Americans is probably the core of what I do in terms of my own research. So, got some questions. So, first one then, Mira. Historically, English has been and often still is defined as the best, the good language, the standard to be measured against. Certainly, this definition is pervasive in camp. Thus, writing and speaking Japanese was seen as both suspect and at least potentially subversive. Was to speak and write in English to accept that set of attitudes and therefore the discriminatory thinking that put Japanese Americans in camp?
I think that's a really good question that I actually don't have an answer for, but I hope that someone is looking at that in more depth. I think sort of the politics of language in the camps would be sort of a great way to look at it. I think that anyone who does it, though, would need to be fluent and literate in both English and Japanese to study it, and unfortunately I am not.
And that would be me too, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think hopefully somebody will do that. Got another question. Mm-hmm. I think most people will recall being told to think about your audience when you write. You make a strong argument that a vital audience for these writings was the writers themselves. Exactly the thing we're told not to do in writing. Clearly, the writing worked. So is it the case that writers and their audience, that is us, are the same?
I think, I think certainly it is true that when I think about working with my own students and their writing, we do want students to get out of their heads a little bit, not be so focused on themselves in order to imagine what it is that they need to say. But there is such a thing as sort of losing track of what it is you want to say because you are speaking so much to your imagined audience. And so I think to some degree we just have to think about that in a little bit more integrated ways. And I know there are people in my field who spend their whole area of study just looking at the question of audience and the ways in which we imagine audience and the ways in which we invoke audience when we write and all of the tensions that imply that. One of the things that I really liked about looking at diaries is because that question of audience starts to I would say it doesn't completely go away, but it melts. Right, and so we're able to sort of get a closer look at sort of what the writer might be working through internally.
There's a pervasive stereotype that Japanese Americans are submissive, Your book offers strong evidence to the contrary and argues that there can be both quiet and assertiveness at the same time. If you could expand on that for us.
Yeah, so really my thinking about this began when I was reading a literary critic, King Kok Chung, whose book, and now I'm forgetting it, Attending? Yes, which one? Articulate Silences, thank you. Yes, and so it was that book that actually got me thinking about this, which I read, I think when I was an undergraduate, not while I was in graduate school, but really wanted to think about why is it that we only see assertiveness as something that is loud, right? That is always loud and outward. That one can, I mean, there is such a thing as talking too much, as filling the room so much that you don't make space for anyone else. And so I think sort of thinking about the ways sort of quietness and loudness go together or need to work together is helpful for us thinking about are actually helpful for us thinking about activism, because I am, just really interested in how we think about language in sort of activist contexts.
If I could follow up on that,
Yeah.
We also have a gendered kind of divide here, that men speak and women speak less. Maybe if you could extend, we have this very, very interesting document that you analyze in depth of these women, moms, in fact, immigrant moms, quietly assertive. So,
well, yeah, and we actually don't know how quiet they were. I mean, they actually might not have been that quiet. But when they were working on this document, what we do know is that they were working on it in hushed tones. They were working on it in secret, that some of the writing about them putting it together says that they were actually saying to themselves, shh, don't talk too loudly, someone might hear you. So that there was this kind of sense that they needed to be quiet in order to do what they were going to do. Yeah.
And just going off of that, if we think I think we have a fairly strong stereotype that immigrant women are not assertive. And if you really want a enormous example, counterexample, is if you go to a department store on December 26th, Target or somewhere, you can see these long lines of immigrant mothers with the packages that they want to return. And by golly, no matter what that person on the other side thought, they will be taking this back, even though there is no gift receipt, and they're going to do it right now.
Yes.
And if we, so we have this image, like I said, we can see this. But we also have, I think, this image of the Issei as stoically suffering and, just the other kind of gaman, I guess, that we think about. And in your work, in the stuff maybe you didn't have a chance to talk about yet, if you could comment on that, how was writing for these women, especially because I suspect very few of them would have been literate in English, but a lot of them would have been literate in Japanese, as we know. Do we have any evidence in English, though, that they were doing this kind of work?
Well, we have, you mean other than the letters to protesting the draft? You mean other than those? Well, I mean, I know that there were lots of diaries done in Japanese by Issei writers, both men and women. I don't have access to them in terms of sort of my own state of my own literacy, if you will. But one of the things that was really common were the poetry clubs, the senryu and the haiku clubs that were organized in several of the camps in which the Issei took part. Both men and women were taking part in greatly. So if you look at a lot of the poems that were written in those clubs, if you look at them even in translation, you will find a lot of really powerful sentiments sort of reflecting on the experience.
Thanks. Let's see. How about we open it up to the audience at this
yeah.
point? So, folks, questions. And we have a mic for you. So if you can just raise your hand, we can send the mic to you.
I'm curious, and I guess I'd like to ask if you were able to talk, identify and talk to anyone of the writers you treat in terms of finding them, while you're writing the book, for example, showing them what they had written and getting any kind of reflection. I mean, would they even remember what they wrote? Or I guess most interesting to me would be, did you find such people, and what kind of comments, especially if the writing involved resistance or protest, what kind of reflections, 35, 40 years later might you have gotten? I was curious about that.
Yeah, actually very few, but I will say that the one person that I did talk to about his writing was actually Frank Emmy. I was able to interview him before he passed, and that's actually how I learned about his sister, right? In his mind, he was just sort of talking about how his sister would, she was a much better typer than I, so she typed all these documents, and the writing researcher in me just went, oh, that's very interesting. Can you say more about that? So I would say that's the one story that I was able to uncover by talking to a writer themselves. In terms of the Mothers Society of Minidoka's work, Fuyo Tanagi, who is one of the women I know who penned the final draft, she was no longer alive, but I was able to meet her daughter and talk with her daughter a lot about her mom and sort of learn more about her. So that would be sort of the next closest chance that I had to talk with someone, yeah.
Well, thank you very much for the very fascinating talk. I look forward to reading your book. My question is, you said you did a lot of research in the archives.
Yes.
Did you know what to look for, or did you have just vast amount of writings and so on?
Yeah, so I basically started with, I would start with sort of keywords that I thought might bring up something like petitions or protests or resistance, and then I'd only get so far, and then I'd have to rethink my terms. I was really sort of fortunate in that at the moment I started doing my research here, there had just been this donation of several boxes of papers from someone named Chika Sugino, and the work had actually not even been organized yet. So the archivist said, well, you're welcome to look through this. So I did. I spent a very large amount of time combing through her papers, and came across a number of things that were really interesting, especially because they hadn't been sort of cleaned up in terms of files, and which was more interesting to me. So I got to see like lots of messy drafts of things, which is what I wanted to see. I got to see like handwritten notes in like a 1943 calendar. She had written poems on the back pages of things that were amazing, amazing commentaries about camp, and I wrote about that in the book as well.
Hello, Mira. That was a wonderful
Naomi.
presentation. So encouraging too, as a writer, to see the importance of writing and how we view things as being quiet, but they're really not on the page. My question, and I'm still processing a lot of what you said, but one question I have is, because like subsequent generations, really view, this is what I've heard in talking with people, view that their parents didn't communicate, or grandparents never communicated certain things to them. Is it an issue of, were we not listening? Was it a language issue? Was it they themselves maybe pushing their writings aside or their thoughts aside? about that particular time, or am I just missing the boat on that issue?
I have no idea. I mean, there's ways in which I feel like I don't even know how to answer that question, because, I mean, it could be that people were saying things and younger generations were just not picking up on the nuances of what they were saying. It's possible that families actually, you know, in their closets, in their attics, have boxes of papers with things that just haven't come out. But it's also possible just in the, you know, in the time period after the war, as people just needed to rebuild their lives, that they just got rid of stuff. You know, I don't want to be reminded of this, which would be understandable as well. But you know, one of my favorite stories that I talk about in the book was how Mitsue Yamada came to write Camp Notes, that book of poetry, right? And she wrote those poems not as poems. She was just writing. While she was working at the front desk at the hospital. She worked at the night shift, so it was very quiet, and she would just write. And then she stuffed all of those poems, she didn't think of them as those, but she stuffed all of those into a shoebox, and she sort of rediscovered them later in the 1970s, you know, when she was already connected to people at the Feminist Press, Kitchen Table Press, and that subsequently led to her book.
Really wonderful book. I'm looking forward to delving into it, and I just thought the little piece that you showed of Yashuko Yuchida's work, or her diary writings, where she's kind of bleeping out cuss words and things like that. I just thought that was so interesting, especially when you sort of look at the trajectory of her writing career, and how she's known, as you mentioned, for the children's literature and establishing Japanese American children's literature. So I think that there's maybe something interesting going on in terms of like the private voice and the very political voice that she allowed herself, and then sort of like her larger literary public voice that became more political perhaps as time went on. I just think that's so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, you know, at the beginning of the talk I mentioned that for me the concept of writing to redress is both that idea of you're writing to redress something right now, but there's also that writing toward redress, right? And that I think that private writing generally, it doesn't always work this way, but it can provide an avenue for working out one's own consciousness, right? Working out one's thinking away from a public eye, and that's really important. I mean, in today's moment, that's so important because, you know, there's a tendency to work out private thoughts in social media, right? And then suddenly things can just sort of blow up. But we need that private space to work out our thinking about stuff because it's messy, and we need time to work out what we're thinking. And I agree. I mean, for me, looking at Yoshiko Cheetah's diaries is so powerful. You know, I mean, she was the first Japanese American children's writer I read as a little girl, and you know, she was really important to me growing up. And so to see her there, you know, swearing at Earl Warren, I mean, but you know, crossing out her, it's so powerful. It's so powerful.
Actually, I got a question. We're sitting here in the museum. I teach about Japanese American history, and every time I teach it, students come up, they go to the museum's website, and there's a now archived exhibit about a European American librarian, children's librarian actually, San Diego, who did this wonderful thing, which is, as people are leaving, was giving them postcards. You know, write me. And so people wrote, Miss Clara Breed. And it was just occurred to me that that's a form of protected, maybe, private writing. In other words, it's going out, but it's going to a very specific audience, an audience that is kind of the one positive, if you will, in this. And I was wondering if have you looked at those?
I didn't look at those mostly because that book about Claire Breed had already been published, and I really wanted to make sure I was looking at sort of new stuff. I also really wanted to make sure I was, as much as possible, focusing on adult voices, because I think there is that tendency, right, to sort of look at how children were experiencing camp and sort of blow that out into sort of what our perception of camp is. And so I was really trying to look at adults. But that said, I do, even in the sort of private writing section of the book, I do look at some personal letters and not just diaries, where the audience was very restricted to this very one person, because I think there is a lot of sort of venting and things like that going on in those letters that I think is important to look at.
Yeah, and I guess we have this perception, maybe talk about it in your book, that was actively, thoughtfully, deliberately constructed to say, okay, we are as a people like this. Yeah. That these letters would obviously, or at least some of them, I'm sure, would contradict.
Or I would say they would complicate it. They would complicate
okay.
it, yeah.
So looking at that then, and this is me because I actually started out, I was a good Asian, I did numbers as a statistician. Yeah, in fact, I have a whole master's thesis that does a multiple regression analysis, way far from what I do now, but I actually did it. How do we determine then to what extent, and is it important to even consider maybe how many people were doing this, that we can, from an, prove this kind of standard of accuracy and proof that you critique?
I think that would be valuable to have that kind of quantified study, that kind of evidence, if you would. And I'm trying to think if even among the stuff I looked at, if it might be possible. I think you could certainly, I think at one point there's something I counted up about one of the petitions that was done in Heart Mountain. I think it was about it might have been the anti-fence petition that was written in Heart Mountain. And it was something like, it was a very high number of adults, it was a very high percentage of the incarcerated adults at Heart Mountain who signed that petition. And because I was just curious, right, like how did this play out in one instance? But I think that, for some people who they like numbers as evidence, certainly that would be powerful. For other people, numbers are less important than that's kind of impressionistic, description of what happened.
Hi, Mira. Thanks for that. I'm looking forward to reading your book this summer, too. It's on my list for the summer. A question, I think, related to what you were just talking about. Did you find in your research the reception of that kind of public writing, such as the petitions from the government or other addressees to which that type of writing was meant to create some kind of change or action?
Yeah, I mean, probably the best known is the reaction to the Fair Play Committee's work. I mean, it landed them all in jail, and all in prison. I didn't look at it in every single case because, in all honesty, it didn't matter to me so much. I was just more interested in the fact that people did it. But I can say that with the Mothers of Minidoka letter, they sent it to the President, the First Lady, the Secretary of War, the Director of Minidoka, and the Director of all the WRA camps. The only person that responded was the First Lady, and she responded in a very curt and short reply that apparently was dictated. It wasn't even signed, and it even said the First Lady didn't have time to sign this because she was leaving. And it was basically a 2-sentence reply saying that she understood the sentiment, but this was really the best way
for Nisei to be accepted back into society, and nobody else responded to the letter. And the women were disappointed, or some of them were disappointed to the extent that they felt like it really failed what they did. And then there were, but there were also other women who felt like, you know what, it just mattered that we said something. It mattered that we voiced our opinion and perspective on this. And you know, as you and I know, Jolivet, from our field, that you know, when we look especially at rhetoric kind of through a feminist analysis, and we are trying to understand women's writing and their literate activities, that sometimes it's less about sort of what if it's successful in the typical way we think of success, and more about the fact that this was voiced, that this was done, that the writing happened, that action was taken. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi. Was your research limited? Did you limit your research to a select few camps, or as you came across these documents and these memos and these private thoughts, did you find that if they came from other camps, was there any similarities to how they trended? Because we're familiar that Minidoka and Heart Mountain had a climate of being resistors, being protesters, and speaking out. And how about the other camps that you came across?
So I never did sort of an analysis in that fashion of sort of camp by camp, and I didn't restrict my research in those ways. I was more restricted by the archives I was using and sort of what happened to be in those collections. I mean, actually, Minidoka has actually been known as being like a more, I mean, is it correct to say more passive camp, or a more well-behaved? It's a more well-behaved camp, I guess. And so actually, for me, finding the stuff from Minidoka was, you know, fabulous, and I guess being from the Pacific Northwest, it also felt very vindicating, you know, like oh look, we have this, you know, we have this too, we have this tradition, but yeah, I think that would be really fascinating, you know, to look at this at it kind of camp by camp. But I actually did find stuff from I think every single camp, something, you know. I probably found more stuff from Heart Mountain and Minidoka, I would say, than the others. But that doesn't mean that other stuff isn't out there. That just happens to be what came across my paths.
Any more questions?
All right, if there's no more questions, I understand there are books to be bought, and you can get them signed. And I really, really would urge you to get this book. I just got it, Amazon. But it was, you know, this experience for me. I read a lot, I'm a professor, that's what we do. But very rarely have I had the kind of experience of reading this work, just opening up all these kinds of possibilities, huge shifts, how you talk about gaman, which is amazing to me, to talk about these Issei women, and we all have this, you know, I think of my own grandmother, and yeah, thinking about complaint and grammar, just as they say, disjoint sets, right? Just not that. And yet here we have this evidence in a wonderfully nuanced, thoughtful, I think, bringing up of this. I think anyone reading this will not only gain intellectually, but as a human being. I think this is an amazing testament to humanity, we might say, personhood, we might say. So do get it. It's really worthwhile.
Thank you, Tom. That's very nice. I just want to thank everyone for coming, but I particularly want to thank Lane for both accepting the book manuscript and for inviting me to come down. I want to thank Tom for agreeing to take part of this. I also want to thank both of them for their research that they've done over the years. I want to thank you to Aiko Yoshinaga Hersig, who is here and guided me through my kind of thinking through how to do archival research. And I also want to thank Karen Ishizuka for her work because her work in Lost and Found really led me down several paths, both with the Mothers of Minidoka and just my general thinking. I also want to thank Naomi Hirahara for her fabulous mystery series about Japanese American communities, which I feel actually should be considered texts in Japanese American studies generally. And thank all of you for coming. Thank you.